This is my cause. I'm like the man who single-handedly built the rocket and went to the moon. What was his name? Apollo Creed?
Please, let's just go to sleep.
No, I refuse to share a bed with someone who thinks I'm crazy. Unless you're feeling amorous.
No, I'm not.
Well then, good night.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by ThatShelf.com. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we realized, well, hey, that's where that Simpson joke comes from. Regardless, each week we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the Rocky to my Mickey, my co-host, Nate Storing. How you doing today, buddy?
I'm good. I feel like I've gone the distance this week.
Are you gonna fly now?
I'm gonna fly now.
Great score. Bill Conti, well done. Well done. His
yeah.
score for the James Bond movie he did is diarrhea, but this one's real good.
Yes. Yeah. On the record, it is a very, very good score.
Did you know he did a James Bond score?
I think I looked that up.
Let me look it up. I'm trying to remember which one it is. For Your Eyes, oh God.
We're getting way off track right off the bat.
I know, right off the bat. For Your Eyes Only. Not a very good Bond movie, not a very good Bond theme. Anyway, okay, but we're not here to talk about James Bond. This week, we watched the 1976 classic, and I do feel like I am right in calling this one a stone cold classic.
Oh, yeah.
Sylvester Stallone's Rocky. Or I guess, is it Sylvester Stallone's Rocky or John G. Avildsen's Rocky?
Ooh.
Are we going to discuss that? I think we're going to
Foreshadowing.
You might remember the Rocky franchise from such Simpson episodes as Season 2's Brush with Greatness, Season 4's Krusty Gets Canceled, Season 6's Lemon of Troy, and Season 8's The Homer They Fall and The Springfield Files. Of course, whenever I think of Rocky and The Simpsons, I think of Rocky 2 plus Rocky 5 equals Rocky 7, Adrian's Revenge.
Yeah, probably the best Rocky joke on The Simpsons, which is ironic because it's not actually about Rocky 1, which is what we're here to talk about today. But
and also, how many Rockies have there now been? Are we actually officially up to 7?
No, I think there was Rocky 5 and then there was Rocky Balboa, which is Rocky 6.
Right.
And then there was Creed, which has Rocky in it. So is that Rocky 7? Not really.
Well, okay, fair enough. I have not seen any of the sequels. In fact, up until last night, had not seen a single Rocky until...
Which is astounding.
Well, yeah, I mean, so Rocky is apparently one of Nate's favorite movies, which, like, if you know my best friend Nate Storing, you would not peg that Rocky would be in your wheelhouse, and yet here we are, and I'm really excited to unpack this with the Rocky superfan Nate Storing.
I mean, it's funny because, like, I wouldn't necessarily say it's one of my favorite movies, but I do think it's really, really good, and I have a very soft spot for the sequels also. Even though they're not quite the masterpiece the original is, it's a very fun series to watch.
Well, before we actually unpack the movie, we always like to unpack the Simpsons episode first. So let's chat about The Homer They Fall, Season 8, Episode 3, original air date November 10th, 1996, directed by Mark Kirkland and written by Jonathan Collier. I watched the episode at lunch today, and if we're being honest, to call this a Rocky episode is maybe a bit of a stretch. It's a boxing episode.
It's
a boxing episode. And obviously there are references to Rocky, but I don't know that I would necessarily classify this fully as a Rocky parody necessarily.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. So, like, the plot of this episode is basically that after Homer tries to rat out Bart's bullies to their parents, he gets beaten up, and then he finds out that he's basically a James Bond villain and has some kind of crazy problem with his brain where he can't be knocked out. He's basically wearing a football helmet at all times. Dr. Hibbert calls it Homer Simpson syndrome.
Why, I could wallop you all day with this surgical 2x4 without ever knocking you down.
Exactly. And so Mo is like, well, maybe you'd be good at boxing. I've never seen a guy take a hit that good. So that's basically like the setup. And the episode, after kind of doing a little research, it seems like the plot is kind of a mashup in typical Simpsons fashion between The Harder They Fall, which is an old boxing movie starring Humphrey Bogart. I believe it's his last movie.
Interesting.
And Rocky. So the Harder They Fall is basically about this unscrupulous manager / journalist played by Bogey, who basically convinces a naive boxer to sort of like come under his wing, and then he fixes all of the fights so that he sort of like is creating this star. But then they take that and they mash it up with Rocky, the whole idea of this underdog challenger getting the opportunity to fight the heavyweight champion of the world, right? So it's kind of those two things together. And Mo is sort of somewhere between Humphrey Bogart and Mickey from The Harder They Fall and from Rocky. And Homer is not really a Rocky character. He's probably, I haven't seen The Harder They Fall, but he seems like he's more like the main character in that, the kind of naive boxer, not an underdog with heart who never applied himself or whatever.
But he does have the same colored trunks as Rocky, I noticed. So,
well observed.
White with a red stripe, not red with a white stripe as Rocky.
Yeah. Excellent.
We're jumping ahead there, though. No spoilers.
And then you have the heavyweight champion of the world, Drederick Tatum. Who is not really an Apollo Creed parody or a Muhammad Ali parody, which is where you get Apollo Creed. He is really a parody of Mike Tyson, who was recently in the news when this episode came out and was recently released from prison. And so it's really a parody of that. And you also have Lucius Sweet, who is... in the script apparently was written as he's a Don King type who sounds and looks exactly like Don King. So that's pretty much the vibe. But again, it's this mashup of all these different things. 2 different movies for the plot, plus contemporary affairs, plus a bunch of other boxing parodies throughout, including, of course, Raging Bull.
Right. Yeah, of course. You can't sort of dance around the fact, no pun intended, that there's also a beautiful Raging Bull parody in the middle of this episode. So I guess the question then is, why are they choosing to parody Rocky? Why do you think, Nate?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously at this point, Rocky is, as we said, a stone cold classic. There's been 5 movies made at the time that this episode has aired, which is pretty remarkable. But what are your thoughts on why they chose to parody this?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like this is one of those weird ones. It's almost a bit like Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, right? Mm-hmm. In that the references to Rocky in this are pretty subtle, and they're more on the plot side than they are on the upfront scene side or like visual or anything like that, or lines. It's more the setup of the episode. And I feel like part of that is just that, look, if you want to do a boxing episode, it's kind of unavoidable to reference Rocky in some way, because not only is it a classic, but honestly, it kind of reshaped the boxing genre or the sports genre in a bunch of ways. And so it feels kind of inevitable that you're going to include it. The other thing is, I suspect they really wanted to talk about Mike Tyson and Don King and like get that in there. And so the Rocky formula of like, he gets to fight the heavyweight champion of the world is like a perfect setup for bringing that Mike Tyson character in. So I think it's just sort of a parody of convenience in a lot of ways. Right.
Yeah, because you can't really do a boxing episode and not touch on Rocky or Raging Bull. You're going to have to make reference to them. So,
but they seem a lot more interested in the earlier eras of boxing.
Well,
again,
of course.
Classic Simpsons fashion, like obviously you have The Harder They Fall, but also they're interested in like, hobo boxing and like back in the day when everyone had funny names like the Southern Dandy and stuff like that.
Kid Gorgeous.
Not so much like, Kid Gorgeous, not so much like 70s boxing and 80s boxing,
I do love the run of all the different hobo names, which apparently were contributed by, surprise, surprise, John Schwartzwelder. And then I do love Mo's run about his boxing name of it's Kid Gorgeous, then Kid Presentable, and then Kid Mo.
I also love the first hobo he fights who can't stop checking his bindle.
Yeah, that's a lovely little like subtle line that's in there. This is one of those classic Simpson episodes where it starts in one direction and then like almost most of the first act has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the episode. And I feel like that was very, very commonplace in the Oakley and Weinstein years. I feel like they did that a lot, but never in a way that sort of made you go, where the hell is this going? Or like, why the hell did they do that? Like, it always felt natural, and the jokes in that sort of first act are always so great. And this literally has one of probably my top 5 favorite Simpson moments that always makes me laugh. And more, just thinking about it makes me laugh. And Morgan always rolls her eyes because I think it's so funny, and she does not understand why I think it's so funny. But when they go to the gadget store and Bart says,
"Hey, Lise, check out the space-age toothbrush."
And Yardley Smith's line delivery of,
"That's an electric nostril groomer,"
makes me like, it's like spit take level funny to me. I don't know why, but I just love it.
It's just the delivery is so perfect.
It's and like the animation, like she's so dry and deadpan, it's genius. But then, like you said, we meet Bart's bully's parents for the first and only time, and I love that they're dressed exactly like their kids for some reason.
Of course, in the same way that, like, you know, Milhouse's parents both look like they're related to him and each other. For whatever reason, all of the couples, all of the parents, they look too related to each other.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then there's also a great line from Marge when Homer like sort of reveals that he's going to become this professional boxer, where she says,
"Homer, of all the crazy ideas you've had, this one ranks somewhere in the middle."
Which I just love that, like, that's a classic sort of Simpsons approach where it's like, we're not going to go right out there and say this is the craziest thing you've ever done, but it's certainly not the least crazy thing that you've ever done.
Right.
And Marge being the voice of reason has to address that. So
yeah, totally. Another like fun little thing that I noticed was in Moe's office, he has a whole bunch of posters in the background, and a couple of them, of course, reference Simpsons writers. You have Moe Szyslak versus Bill Oakley, and Mark Kirkland versus David Silverman in the background there.
Now that's a fight I would like to see.
Yeah, there you go. The classic sort of VHS humor that they have going on here.
Okay, well, let's get into it. Let's get into the movie. Nate, I know you're so excited to do this. You were chomping at the bit for us to do Rocky.
Hell yeah.
So let's unpack it. Let's talk about 1976's Rocky.
All right, man. Well, to start, how would you sum up this movie in a sentence?
I should have probably thought about this beforehand. An amateur underdog boxer gets the opportunity of a lifetime to prove that he can go the distance.
All right, sure, I'll take it. It's a very pitchable movie.
Yeah, and it's also, the plot of this movie is not complicated. Like, it's literally, we meet amateur boxer, we meet professional boxer. Professional boxer wants to make a name for himself and decides he's gonna box with amateur boxer. For whatever reason, they decide to go with the amateur that we met at the beginning of the movie. And there's like a romance subplot throughout, and
a B plot.
Yeah, a B plot. that his best friend's sister happens to be bookish, but if she just took off that hat and glasses, she'd be adorable. It is very, very simple in its structure, but I think that's one of the things the film ultimately has going for it, is that it doesn't try to bite off more than it can chew. And totally. I kind of admire that about it.
Yeah, I think it does a lot with that very simple plot, just in the acting, the small moments that it sort of finds within that plot go a really long way to kind of fleshing it out beyond just that really basic one line. So Adam, you obviously haven't seen this before, but how would you describe your sort of background with this movie? What did you know about it before? You know, what was its sort of reputation in your mind?
I mean, this is going to come as a surprise to no one who's been listening to our podcast. I knew about this movie through the AFI Top 100.
There you go.
It's so funny. It's one of those movies that I never saw, never really had any desire or interest to see, because I don't really care for sports movies, because I find them to generally be pretty samey. I knew it was sort of like the movie that gave Sylvester Stallone his big break. I knew that Talia Shire, aka Connie Corleone, aka Francis Ford Coppola's sister, was in it. I knew it had a kick-ass theme song, and I knew that Rocky didn't win. That was basically what I knew. I did not realize that Apollo Creed was Carl Weathers, and when he showed up for the first time, I, of course, naturally couldn't stop thinking about that scene in Arrested Development where he tells Tobias that he's got a stew going, baby.
You take this home, throw it in a pot, add some broth, a potato. Baby, you got a stew going.
So
I think I want a refund.
Yeah, I didn't really know what to expect. If I'm being 100% honest, I kind of went into it being like, this might be a bit of a slog for me because it's not really my cup of tea, not something that I would normally choose to watch. But knowing that you are so fond of the film and spoke so highly of it, I was sort of like, okay, I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to give it a chance and we'll see where it takes me. But how about you? Like, how did
you are keeping your cards real close to your chest?
I'm giving them real close to my chest. Yeah, no, I know. I'm not. I told you, I'm not giving you an inch before I'm ready. How about you though? How did you come to? Because again, like knowing you and your taste, the fact that you think so highly of Rocky is insane to me. Because this does not.
Yes.
There's nothing about this movie that feels like a Nate Storing movie.
Totally. It's so funny because I was trying to think back, like, when did I first see this movie? So, like, I don't think I ever saw it growing up. Because, like, you know, we're not a sports family. I'm not big on sports myself, to your point.
We should point out that both Nate and I, we got our high school gym credit not by taking gym, but by taking kinesiology, because that's how much of not sports guys we are. The thought of us actually doing physical activity was mortifying, so we would much rather do projects about, I think you made a virtual knee, if I'm not mistaken.
I did. I got 100% on that project. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I made a documentary about football hooliganism that was hosted, I am doing air quotes, hosted by Jason Statham. And I don't think I got 100%, but I did very well on that project. I think our teacher was very impressed by what these two arts students were capable of doing.
So all that to say, I think I first saw it in university. Right. I'm pretty sure that it was part of my little run after I watched The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is one of my favorite movies. I sort of watched that on a whim and was sort of like, look, there are all these movies out there that you'd seen parodied everywhere, that you'd heard about, but you'd never actually seen them, right? And so, you know, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and Rocky are both movies that have this reputation that is so jokey, you know? Yeah. They're really kind of easy to make fun of. And so I'm pretty sure I watched it after I saw The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in a run of movies where I was sort of watching these highly parodied movies. And I remember watching it and being like, man, this is actually a really good movie. Like, it's not just fun. It's not just iconic. It's actually like unexpected, I think, in the way that most of the runtime is used. You know, as Stallone was always saying when he was promoting this movie, you know, a lot of people think it's a fight picture, but, you know, it's not really a fight picture, right? It's like drama, you know? It is. It's character actors acting for most of the movie. Yeah. And then there's a fight at the end, you know? Yeah. So that's sort of my experience with it. And I've rewatched it several times. I've watched the entire series. I don't think I saw Rocky Balboa when it came out, but I've watched all of the Creed movies in theaters since they came out.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And really, really enjoyed them. I think actually Creed is pretty incredible as a series. I think all three movies are really, really good and all kind of have a different take on that character and really stretch the Rocky formula in different directions too, which I appreciate.
Right. You obviously had seen this post Karate Kid, right?
Yes. Yeah, because I definitely saw Karate Kid when I was young, when I was a Karate Kid.
Okay.
And this was like definitely when I was at university.
Right. Okay, well, we've already sort of talked a little bit about the plot, but I feel like we owe it to our audience to do our usual official plot synopsis from a random source. So what have you got for me today, Nate?
Yeah, so I was looking around. Often I try to go find a press kit But the press kit for this movie, because it was very indie, I mean, it was technically United Artists, but there was not a big budget, right? The press kit for this was like just a series of photos with captions, basically. There wasn't
right.
like a fancy press kit for it. So I found something from that, but it's a little too short. So I'm going to read a synopsis from the back of the original 1982 VHS release of the movie.
Right.
Awarded Best Picture of the Year in 1976, Rocky has won the hearts of millions everywhere. Sylvester Stallone stars in the title role as a 2-bit fighter with a once-in-a-lifetime shot at the world heavyweight title. Talia Shire plays Adrian, a lonely young woman who develops a tender and beautiful relationship with Rocky. A timeless story about the pursuit of the great American dream, capitalized.
Wow.
Rocky has universal appeal that is unsurpassed.
Okay.
A lot of hyperbole there. I don't know if it...
slightly hyperbolic, but it does what it says on the tin.
Mm-hmm.
It knows what it is, and it executes on that premise perfectly. I kind of admire the fact that it's not trying to do everything in a kettle of fish. Like it's just,
Mm-hmm.
it is essentially this simple story about a simple man. It's pretty efficient in its storytelling. There's not a lot of scenes in this movie where I'm like, look, you're not going to hear this often from me on this show. There's not a lot of scenes in this movie that I would say we could lose this. This is not a movie where I went away being like, oh, this could have stood to lose 10 or 15 minutes. Like it's very efficient.
I mean, look, it's a 98-page script directed by an editor.
So yeah.
So yeah, it's like it is, you're right. It's very, very efficient, but it also leaves enough room to have character moments and have things that are really just about world building, but it is everything counts. Every one of those little juicy pieces is important to the movie and doesn't feel like extra, I think.
Absolutely. Okay, well, before we get too deep into the weeds here, can you sort of give me a little bit of background on how this film came to be? Because I think this is the thing that is going to maybe be surprising to people who, certainly if you don't already know the story of how Rocky came to be. Later in life, I discovered this, but, I just sort of assumed, Sylvester Stallone is one of those characters who's been around forever. I didn't realize for many years that he wrote this movie. And then directed multiple sequels to this movie. What's his story? How does Rocky go from just a little idea on the page to this global phenomenon?
So, I mean, this is the thing about Rocky is that it is incredibly tied up with Sylvester Stallone's story and his sort of myth in a lot of ways. Even before this film opened, the marketing of the film really positioned it as an American classic and really was all about emphasizing Sylvester Stallone's story because he was a lot like Rocky. He was this actor who hadn't quite made it. He was in an indie picture called The Lords of Flatbush. But other than that, he wasn't really doing a lot of serious film work, certainly not what he wanted to do. And so he was sort of inspired to write this script after seeing a fight between Muhammad Ali and Chuck Wepner, who was sort of this underdog who fought him and went the distance, right? And after he saw that, he wrote the script in like 3.5 days.
Wow. And
the key part of the story is that then he starts shopping around the script, but he is adamant that he has to play the lead role. Because basically it's like he wanted a vehicle for his acting career. And he really wrote the character to be, as he would say later in interviews, it's basically just him in boxing shorts. Right. His plight is the exact same as Rocky's. He's a guy who never quite had a break, but has it in him to go the distance and just needs that one thing to sort of put him over the top. And for Stallone, Rocky, the movie, is that thing that puts him over the top. So studios, though, they were like interested in the script and they would make offers to Stallone, but they wanted someone else to star because he was a nobody, basically. Right. So they had ideas like Ryan O'Neal, James Caan. That one I think is actually kind of interesting for this movie. I could see that. Burt Reynolds, Robert Redford.
Legitimately huge stars at the time. Like 1976. Totally. Those are the biggest names out there.
Yep. And United Artists made an offer to him originally, but they wanted someone else to play the role. And Stallone would just keep turning them down again and again and again. And so eventually, Irwin Winkler and Robert Cardiff at United Artists, they express interest, and they are kind of on board with the idea of Stallone starring in it. So they actually go to United Artists and they decide to use this provision in their contract that they can make any movie they want if it's under, I think, $1.5 million. Right?
Okay.
So United Artists comes back and they say, actually, this is really a $2 million picture. And they're thinking like, okay, great. Well, we'll get the movie, but then we'll get to cast whoever we want. Winkler and Cardiff don't go for that.
Right.
They come back and they say, all right, look, we'll do it for $1 million, not 1.5, and we will guarantee any additional funding to ensure that it's completed. And United Artists agrees to that, and Stallone gets to star in the film, basically.
Wow.
It's this kind of like legendary Hollywood story, and again, immediately becomes part of the marketing for this movie, is the sort of bootstrap story of how it gets made. So Avildsen, John G. Avildsen, who we've talked about before on this podcast, he's the director of the Karate Kid trilogy.
And it sounds like it's quickly becoming one of Nate's favorite filmmakers.
I mean, he's just a really interesting character. It's hard to not root for him because he's also kind of a Rocky character in a lot of ways. He's a guy who, like, before this, had made a few movies that did pretty well. He made a movie called Joe. He made a movie called Save the Tiger. Both of them got Oscar nominations for screenplay, and actually Jack Lemmon won for Best Actor in a Lead Role for Save the Tiger, but nothing for the filmmaking side of it, right? But he was, he's sort of in the picture. Before that, he did a lot of like exploitation movies that were sort of like sex comedies and things like that.
The kind of thing that Stallone was starring in prior to this.
Right, exactly. The same sort of world. But Rocky is the movie that is really probably his best known and also best loved movies that he's worked on. Right. This is really his big break in a lot of ways, even though he had a long, long career filmmaking. We'll come back to Avildsen a bunch later, probably. But he basically gets brought into this because two things. He knows how to make low budget movies that have big multipliers. He has a great track record of that. And he agreed to all the terms. He was like, yeah, Stallone, fine, sure. And yeah, $1 million, sure, no problem, I can do that. So that's basically like all they wanted, and that's what they got from Avildsen. So this movie is a 28-day shoot. So very compressed. Avildsen did this basically by doing a whole bunch of rehearsal up front. So like the fight scene, all of the heavy acting scenes, all of that is done up front. We talked about this in the Karate Kid episode, but he also carries this 8mm camera with him everywhere. So as early as the auditions, Avildsen's already shooting footage on his 8mm camera, testing out angles, testing out how it looks and feels. So he's doing a lot of work up front to make the most of that 28-day shoot. So that's very cool.
Okay, well, let's actually tuck into the movie itself and dissect certain elements. Where should we start our conversation, Nate? Because I think there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, for sure. So how about we start with Adam? Did you like the movie?
I thought we saved that for the end. Yeah, I did. I mean, I'm not gonna lie to you. I mean, it's interesting. I don't think I loved the movie, but I think I was surprised by the movie. When it started, I was a little bit worried that I was like, oh dear, what have I gotten myself into? And it was the scene at the ice rink where I was like, okay, I think I get this now, because Rocky is kind of a dullard. He's kind of like a dope. He's just like this goofball. I don't want to call him a loser because that feels unkind based on where we go, but he is portrayed as kind of just this schlubby loser. He talks like this, and what do you want, man? And you're just sort of like, this is my hero? This is who I'm going to be rooting for by the end of this? and then something just sort of clicks. You know, there's a few scenes that sort of set him up early in the film. He goes back to his boxing gym and his locker's been taken away from him. And, you know, Burgess Meredith he's a bum. And there's the scene relatively early on where he goes back to the pet store where Adrian works. And it's at night and he's like, oh, you want me to walk you home? You know, there's a lot of creeps out there. And they're setting him up to be this, like, beefy, like, giant of a man, but, like, clearly with the brain of a toe. Gentle giant, maybe, is the appropriate term.
I think the part of the thing is that there's like 20 save the cat moments in the first 15 minutes of this movie.
Absolutely.
Of just like Rocky, you know, giving advice to kids and talking to his pets and not breaking the guy's thumbs. And they're just like hammering you again and again with this idea of like, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. He's a good guy.
And not only that, like, I feel like we've been discussing it the most this season, but this idea of like having to watch these movies with a modern eye, thinking back to what was it like for audiences in 1976? Because again, I'm watching this knowing Sylvester Stallone of 2023, who is very different than Sylvester Stallone of 1973. Like, he is successful. He's not an underdog. He's like one of the most successful action stars of the last few decades, right? Like, it's him, Arnold, you know, The Rock, Jason Statham, like, it's the Expendables.
The Expendables.
Like, he's the head of the Expendables. He's Mr. Expendable. So, you know, the idea of him being an underdog is a little kind of like hard to take. And it seems like, well, the way that we're supposed to buy this is that he's like playing it like he's a bit of a dope. But then you get to that ice rink scene and I don't know what it was. Because I also wrote down too, like, one of my notes was, oh, I guarantee you at some point Adrian's going to take those glasses off and oh my gosh, there's a beautiful woman under there. And
oh my God, that's Talia Shire.
Yeah, like, and they do that joke. And it was funny. My wife was eating dinner while I was watching it. And she's like, what the hell is wrong with these two people? Like, and I was like, I don't know. Like, I think she's just shy and he's a bit of a dope.
Well, there was a great sort of moment in the commentary for the film where Talia Shire was talking about her choices with the character.
Right.
And basically what she was saying is like, look, Rocky is a big cartoonish character. And so she felt that in order for it to work, she had to also have a sort of cartoonish, or not cartoonish, but big character sort of thing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
so she's got the cat eye frames. She's very extremely mousy. What I was thinking to myself watching these performances and the other performances too, like Polly and Mickey and all of these characters, they're all kind of like Eleanor Rigby people, you know? They're like these kind of sad, forgotten, broken, lonely people. Like, you know, they're not necessarily bad people, but none of them got a break in life. And that kind of also affected their personalities, right? They've like lived with being on the outs, and it's affected the way they are. Polly is so angry, and Mickey's angry, and Adrian is incredibly shy. And Rocky, the thing that makes him special is he's the only one who maybe has a little bit of a spark of hope and honestly, and corniness. This is, I think, the saving grace of the movie in some ways, is that he's the only one who's corny, and everyone in the world of the movie knows he's a corny guy. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that being said, it's funny that the film is sort of able to overcome its, I don't know if tropiness is the right word, but like these characters are caricatures. Like they are, like you said, Adrian's a cartoonish level of mousiness, and Polly's a cartoonish level of drunken, jealous best friend, and Mickey's a cartoonish level of, you know, gruff manager. And I was surprised at how little Mickey actually came into play. I thought he was going to be a lot of a bigger part of this, and he really isn't. And then, of course, like Apollo Creed is literally a cartoon character. Like his entrance into the fight could not be more cartoonish. I mean, it literally felt like something ripped out of a Simpsons episode. But the magic of the film is that despite the fact that, like, none of this should work. Like, I think that's ultimately what I was thinking, was like, none of this should work. This should be a comically terrible movie that was, laughed out of theaters, and people should have come away from it being like, what a piece of shit this was. And yet it's able to overcome all of its shortcomings because it's got a lot of heart. And I don't know, like maybe it's the softy in me. Maybe it's just the fact that I admire the authenticity of that heart. But I think that's part of it, is that none of it comes across as inauthentic. It's clearly written by someone who's new to the art of writing film, but that has a really, really simple, strong message and is doing so authentically. This is not ironic. It's not postmodern. I'm going to tell this story of a guy down on his luck who overcomes it, has this opportunity, and ultimately doesn't necessarily succeed, but that doesn't matter to him because to him, he's won. And there's an earnestness there that I admire and can't help but come away from enjoying.
No, totally. I think there are like a couple factors that are so critical to that working. And one of them, I think, is the era that this comes in, right? So this movie comes in 1976. And everything that's come before it in the previous decade is new Hollywood, right?
Right.
This sort of idea of the Hollywood Renaissance. You have this new generation of people that are bringing certain things to the table. The studio system has been flipped on its head. So you have actors, writers, and directors really running the show in terms of the authorial intent. And you get movies that are reflective of that, right? That are challenging, that are naturalistic, that are just trying new things. It's Dog Day Afternoon, it's Bonnie and Clyde, it's all of those sorts of movies, right?
Yeah.
And this movie, in a lot of ways, comes at the very tail end of that, which I think is this really interesting moment. Is this part of new Hollywood, that whole vibe, or is this the beginning of something new? And I think it's kind of right on the cusp of that. It's right before you get Star Wars and other things like that really kind of change it back in a different direction. The sort of Hollywood blockbuster era, Spielberg and Lucas kind of running the show and that being the focus of all the studios. But at the same time, I think that this movie, in my opinion, is also kind of a direct response to some of those movies of this era because it is so optimistic. The sort of tricky balance that it's trying to play with is that on one hand, it is very optimistic. It's almost a throwback to like Frank Capra.
It is very Capra-esque.
Another person we've covered, of course, on the podcast. Yep. We watched It's a Wonderful Life. John G. Avildsen really looked to Capra as like a real inspiration for his kind of filmmaking. And I think that story in Sylvester Stallone's script was very appealing to him, partly because it sort of resonates with Capra's sensibilities, right? I actually found this great interview from 1977 in the New York Times where they talked to Capra, and he said that he thinks Rocky is the best picture of the last 10 years. It got his vote for the Oscars all the way down the line. And when he saw it, he thought, boy, that's a picture I wish I had made.
Wow. Well, it's interesting, too, though, because, like, being Canadian, I must admit my knowledge of American history is not ideal. So maybe I'm completely off base. But I noticed that one of the other top films of this year was one of my all-time favorites, All the President's Men, which is obviously about Nixon and Watergate. And so knowing that this is coming out post-Nixon era America when... There's probably I would have to imagine, if only based on how things have felt for us in the last few years, coming out of a era of a president that maybe, how do you put it? Not so good. Like I have to imagine that a film like this is kind of resonating in a way because it's speaking to an audience that maybe is looking for something like this because the mid 70s is a very sort of difficult time. Vietnam War is coming to an end, but like a lot of change is happening. And I feel like, again, like you say, the sort of new Hollywood, like there is this sort of undercurrent in that cinema of like this dark and grittiness of a French Connection or a Dog Day Afternoon. And a movie like this that is just trying to like root for the underdog and like you say, have this happy, optimistic ending is probably kind of refreshing.
Yeah, totally. And I think the way it gets away with that in the context of a world that is, a pretty troubling place in a bunch of ways, is that it is using the language of New Hollywood to tell a Frank Capra story.
Right.
Right. All of the acting is incredibly naturalistic. Again, big cartoony characters in certain ways, but the way they play them is like, so straight, lots of improvisation, very rooted in these very naturalistic performances. Like Burt Young, he went, I believe, to the acting workshop. Before that, he had no experience in acting. He had a criminal record, and he went and begged and said, "Please train me."
He looks it. I not to be unkind, but he has that great character actor look of he looks like he literally was just picked up off the streets and was thrown into this movie and does a phenomenal job.
Yeah, these are all method people. The cinematography, right? And the setting. It's like they're shooting actually in Philadelphia. They had no on-set lighting for most, especially for the outdoor stuff. They're shooting in daylight. And, again, I think this is where John G. Avildsen's skills sort of come perfectly into frame, so to speak. It's like the guy's shooting on 8mm all the time. He's paying attention to light conditions. He's used to shooting in naturalistic settings. He's working with a cinematographer, but he has an eye for understanding how this is all going to work in a context that's maybe not ideal. And so it looks like Dog Day Afternoon.
It really, it's funny I invoked the French Connection because it has that sort of Friedkin-esque documentary realism to it that, especially now, a lot of filmmakers try to achieve, but very few filmmakers actually manage to achieve that sort of feeling of almost like a fly on a wall verite style that it's fiction, but if you were to then be told oh no, we actually just kept the cameras rolling and nobody really knew what was going on at any point, you kind of would believe it. There is this sort of realism to the cinematography and to the staging and the framing of everything that certainly elevates the script and sort of takes it beyond those sort of cartoony elements, I think. If you were to film this in a more sort of proscenium style, it would feel very stagey or cartoony and it wouldn't work. But when you combine it with that sort of documentary realism, it sort of balances all of that out.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's interesting about this is that I think the script is quite conscious of what it's doing in that way. So the big fight between Apollo Creed and Rocky is to celebrate the American bicentennial.
Yeah.
Right? It's a super conscious decision. Yes, of course, they were taking advantage of the fact that the bicentennial was coming, but at the same time, it's a fight about America. At one point, a reporter says to Apollo Creed, he's like, "Is it a coincidence that you're fighting a white man on the most celebrated day in the country's history?" And Apollo sort of turns it on his head and he says, "I don't know about that. Is it a coincidence that he's fighting a black man on the most celebrated day in the country's history?" Right? Yeah. So there is this undercurrent of racial tension of, when Rocky's jogging through Philadelphia, it's like he's jogging through the Italian market. There's burning trash cans, there's garbage, there's abandoned cars. This is happening in the middle of putting on my urban history hat for a moment here. This is happening in what we call the urban crisis in America, where a combination of policies at the federal level, suburbanization that's supported by the federal government, highway construction, slum clearance, all this stuff basically leads to white flight and disinvestment in central cities. And Philadelphia lost 13% of its population during the 1970s alone, but had already been losing population before that. Jeez. So it's that's the context that this is happening in. And I actually think even though the script is very uplifting, the production's quite conscious of, I think, that whole context.
Right.
And is sort of referencing it in various ways and saying, look, I know the situation is bad. I know when you look around you, the country feels like it's falling apart sometimes. I know there's tension, but this story, at least, is trying to tell you the American dream is still viable. A nobody can still make it in this country. Whether you believe that or not is a whole other thing. But like, that's, I think, really what this story is about, is like, they're saying this is the bicentennial. This is a trial of the American dream. And the author is saying, yes, the American dream is still alive and well, or at least we can believe in it.
Right. I do want to dig more into Avildsen and his contributions, because we've obviously talked about him before. And I think having that context of his other arguably most successful film and this one will be interesting. But before we do, I do want to talk a little bit more about the cast, because there's some really interesting casting going on here. And I'm going to pose this question to you.
Mm-hmm.
Is Stallone a good actor? Because I look, I liked the film. I liked his performance, but I'm not convinced yet. And again, like, I know he's still relatively new to all this. Certainly, like, he's appeared in other films. It was funny, I was looking at his filmography. He was an uncredited extra in some pretty heavy hitters. I'm just going to pull them up here. Downhill Racer, MASH, Bananas, the Woody Allen movie. Clute, which is a great, if I'm not mistaken, that's also a Alan J. Pakula. Yeah, Alan J. Pakula, who did All the President's Men. What's Up, Doc, which I think is on our short list of films to cover. With Barbra Streisand and Ryan O'Neal. So, like, he's been in some legitimate stuff. But this is obviously, like, his breakthrough role. I guess it's one of those things where it's tough to truly judge him, because I'm not sure. You said it yourself. Like, he's playing Sylvester Stallone in boxing shorts. Like, is he acting or is he just delivering the lines? Like, I don't know. But so that's why I wanted to ask you, like, do you think he's a good actor?
Yeah, I would say that this was the most important story he had to tell, and that he is the perfect person to play the role.
Yes.
And I would say, again, I've seen all of the Rocky movies, the whole series. I think he's very good in those movies. And I think that in some of the sequels, he has harder scenes to play. Like, in this movie, he's basically Paddington Bear.
Yeah, that's actually a really good analogy.
We'll talk a little bit about Apollo Creed, but Apollo Creed is not the villain of this story.
No.
Apollo Creed is a foil to Rocky. They're actually similar characters who bounce off of each other. The villain of this story is cynicism. Is like, the entire world is kind of against him. They're all so negative and always kind of like telling him he can't do it, telling him the world's a bad place, and he's just kind of this corny guy in a cynical world. But in later movies, there's more conflict between him and other characters. Rocky becomes a more imperfect character who makes mistakes. He does have a chance to kind of flesh out the character and does it quite well, I think. That said, I don't think I've seen him in another role that I've liked him as much in.
Right. The scene that comes to mind where I feel like you can see the inexperience, and again, he could beat the living shit out of me, so I just like I'm
all due respect.
All due respect to the man. Though, you know, apparently he's a painter now, so maybe he's much gentler. But the scene where Mickey comes to his house to basically plead to be his manager, and he sort of refutes him. And then after Mickey leaves, he kind of has a monologue where he's beating up the door of his bathroom, and he's sort of saying, like, yeah, you know, yeah, my house stinks. Yeah, I got hard. Like, where were you 10 years ago? And he's like, kind of, that scene kind of goes on maybe a little too long. But that's kind of the one scene where I was like, okay, I don't know that he necessarily has the chops to pull this off. Like, I've seen this scene in other movies, and I think it's done better, and it's the one scene where his inexperience sort of shows through. You know, opposite to that, like the scene I've mentioned that sort of won me over, the scene in the ice rink where it really just feels like you're witnessing this date between two people. Like, it feels so authentic and so realistic. And he's just sort of like talking and being this charming kind of doofus, but also like opening up when she asked him why he wanted to fight, and he's like, well, my dad told me I didn't have much of a brain, so I better work on my body. And then she gives the the devastating line of, my mother said the opposite of, like, I didn't have much of a body, so I better work on my brain. And I was just like, oh my god, like, what kind of person tells their daughter that? Like,
Yeah.
And all the while, you've got the Zamboni guy like shouting in the background,
2 minutes,
7 minutes, like, which adds this sort of lightness to the scene. I don't know,
reality to the scene.
Yeah,
a lot of scenes like that in other movies become this sort of like too magical, too serious, too much connection, and it kind of forgets that like they're in the real world. And I love that the custodian of the rink is like reminding them that they're running out of time. Like it's just such a nice touch.
Well, and it's again, I think it speaks to Avildsen's skill as a director that he recognizes, okay, this scene it's bordering on saccharine. Like every time it's just getting to the edge where you're like, oh, is this going to start to be too cheesy?
Yep.
That's when the Zamboni breaks in and you have a little moment of levity and you're like, okay, this is working for me.
Oh, I've got a whole take on this, sir. I will get there. But going back to that scene between Rocky and Mickey, I wanted to say that I think the reason that scene does work for me is because of Burgess Meredith. Because
the front half of the scene works for me. It's when it's when Mickey leaves that it doesn't work for me as much.
But see, the thing that's great is that you're watching Rocky freak out. He comes into the bathroom. He's yelling at Mickey. Mickey's already gone, but he's saying, where were you? This place stinks, etc., etc. And what you see is Burgess Meredith slowly walking down the stairs, and you can feel Mickey coming through from the back of that man's shoulders. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like he is just acting the hell out of that role. And there's a moment, I think, where he turns around and you can just see this sort of conflicted look on his face. He is selling Stallone's performance in that scene for me. I love Burgess Meredith in this. Again, a big character, right? Who's got a crazy voice. Every time I hear him talk or see him with his like little snarl, I think of Mo.
Oh, see, that's not who I think of. I mean, come on. I think of Burgess Meredith as the f***ing Penguin in the 1960s Batman series.
Sure. I am an aristocrat of crookery, my dear man.
The whole time like I just kept being like, this is insane that the Penguin is now an 80-year-old man coaching Rocky. But like,
no. See, the insane thing is that a leading man from the 1930s went on to play Mickey and the Penguin in the Batman show.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, and let's be clear, Burgess Meredith is the least crazy thing of casting in the Batman series. In a show where Cesar Romero refuses to shave his mustache to play the Joker. But don't worry, folks, we will eventually cover all the insanity of that on a later episode. But yeah, no, I mean, Burgess Meredith was one of those things, like I was genuinely surprised at how little screen time he had, because he's, at the time anyway, the one name in the film. Like he gets the Burgess Meredith credit. Maybe you knew him as the 1930s leading man, or more likely you knew him as the Penguin from Batman. And now in 2023, you recognize Carl Weathers and you might recognize Talia Shire. But for him to be in this film so little, and I guess maybe part of that is because, again, thinking about The Simpsons and the fact that Mo in that episode is like the mentor. And so I'm like, oh, the mentor character is going to be a lot bigger in this. And again, in the AFI 100, like all of the scenes that they show are like the training montage, the scenes with Burgess Meredith. So I just assume like, oh, most of this movie is going to be about Rocky gets this opportunity and then Burgess Meredith is going to take him under his wing and teach him everything he knows. But like, that's not what happens at all. And I was a little bit surprised by that. Like I said, he maybe has, I don't know, like 20 minutes of screen time, if that.
Yeah. Well, see, the Simpsons connection is that the Mo character is much more of the Humphrey Bogart character, who's the main character of The Harder They Fall.
Yes.
And especially in that movie, in the final fight, Bogey has a change of heart. It's exactly what happens in that episode. But like, yeah, it's funny, again, how those parodies kind of skew our expectations of how these movies are going to work.
Before we move on, I do want to touch again on Talia Shire, because I think she gives a very underrated performance.
Totally.
It's interesting that you say that she was like, that she thought about how to portray this character, and that like Rocky is this cartoon, so she has to play it almost cartoonish. Because again, when you're first introduced to her, she is comically mousy, comically bookish. As I said, I wrote down, oh, they're going to do the reveal where she like takes off her hat and glasses and oh my God, she's beautiful. But the thing that's so astonishing is that this role could not be further from Connie Corleone. Like, if you know her, that's the only other movie I've seen her in is Godfather and Godfather 2. And I think she's also maybe in Godfather 3. I can't remember if she's in Godfather 3 or if her character's dead. But certainly Godfather 1 and 2 she's in and plays such a different character, such a big character. The famous scene in Godfather 1, the scene that essentially allowed Coppola to keep his job, where she's like throwing the plates and beating up her husband after finding out that he's been stepping out on her. Like, that's such a big performance, a character with so much rage and energy, and this is so reserved and so dialed back. I think it really is maybe my favorite performance in the film, although Burt Young might maybe give her a run for her money.
He's also excellent. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about this movie is that, like, it is such a horse race in terms of what the best performance is. Like, all of the main actors are doing a pretty great job. You can kind of debate about Stallone, but like, he's so well cast that regardless of whether you think he's the best actor in the world, he's kind of perfect for the role, you know. And then like the other four characters I think are just killing it, right? Talia Shire, Burt Young, Carl Weathers, and Burgess Meredith. It's like they're all just killing it in these roles.
The four sort of supporting roles are so strong, they kind of prop up the ineffectiveness, for lack of a better term, of the lead. It's funny, it reminds me of Seinfeld in a weird way. Because the thing that I've always said about Seinfeld is like, Jerry is the worst of the bunch. He's a terrible actor. You could take him out of the show and the show would still absolutely work, because Kramer, Elaine, and George are so good at what they're doing, and they prop him up and they allow him to act as sort of the straight man and so on and so forth. So it's like this classic thing of like, yes, he's technically the lead, but it's the supporting characters that allow his lead performance to work. And I think this is another perfect case of that, of like, Stallone, for all of his strengths and all of his weaknesses, his performance works because the other performances are also working so well. With all of those other performances surrounding him, it allows for the sort of less polished performance to work.
Sure. Yeah, no, I buy that. This is very much an ensemble in some ways, even though obviously it's like, yeah, the movie's called Rocky and the climax is about Rocky and his fight. This really would not work if you didn't have such a stellar ensemble, like pulling it all together.
Totally.
But that said, I do want to talk about the director, about John G. Avildsen.
Yes.
And what is he bringing to the table in this? Because here's my hot take on this movie. I think that his role in the success of this movie is totally underrated. And that because of the way this movie was marketed, we maybe give Stallone too much credit. I mean, look, the guy wrote the script. It's his idea. It's his character. He stars in it, obviously, and carried the franchise after this movie. However, I would argue that the things you think of when you think of Rocky are actually largely due to John G. Avildsen's contributions. So from that, I would love to like take you on a tour of the rest of this movie from some key moments, and we can talk about each of them and John G. Avildsen's contributions, but also just what you thought about them. So
absolutely.
One of the first things that you already brought up was the skating scene, which is sort of the first date between Rocky and Adrian. Basically, the setup is it's Thanksgiving. They had this horrible fight with Polly, which is funny but also awful, where he like takes the turkey out of the oven that Adrian was cooking and throws it out the door, and then sort of casually asks Rocky if he wants a piece. You know, so anyway, Rocky takes her out on a date, but it's Thanksgiving, so everything's closed. So he goes to the skating rink. He basically talks the custodian into letting them onto the rink for a short period of time to skate around. Super, super sweet. In the script, this was written as a coffee date.
Oh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Stallone wrote it as they just have a conversation at a diner or something. And Avildsen said, look, that's really boring. Like, there's nothing worse than just watching two people like talk with nothing else going on. They should be doing something like bowling or whatever. I don't know, something. And so they come up with the idea of the rink, and Stallone goes back and he writes it as, okay, they're going to go to the skating rink and there's going to be lots of people and it's going to be like all this sort of stuff. And Avildsen's like, look, we don't have the budget for that. So Avildsen is like, maybe it's closed. And so that whole setup, which again, I think is part of the magic of that scene, you know, it's kind of awkward, it's makeshift. They're not having this sort of uninterrupted magical moment. It's like, it feels very grounded in reality.
Well, he's not even wearing skates. Like,
he's not wearing skates.
You're not going to wear skates? No, of course not.
He's just jogging next to her on the ice. Yeah, it's like all of those details that make it specific and memorable.
Yeah.
Avildsen.
Interesting. Yeah, because like that is what makes that scene so special and so unique, is that it is this sort of like fish out of water. They're at a skating rink and he's not wearing skates and like there's nobody else there, and the Zamboni is like, that's 7 minutes. Like it's
and that's what turned you around on the movie.
That is literally the scene that won me over. I think prior to that I was like, okay, this is fine, but I'm like, okay. And then that scene was the one that from that point on I was sold.
Yeah. Exactly. So this is jumping ahead a little bit. So stop me if I'm moving too quickly. But let's talk about the training montage. Yeah. So this is probably the most parodied thing about this movie.
Easily the most iconic moment of the film. Arguably one of the most iconic moments of 70s film history.
Yeah, all of film history, honestly.
Yeah, honestly.
And I was trying to like look deep into this and be like, look, is there a precedent for this? Where did this come from? Whose idea was it? How was it developed? Surprisingly, there isn't actually that much about this other than, you know, like lists of the greatest top 10, you know, whatever.
Training montages, yeah.
Training montages. I found one that does talk about, there's also a training montage in Taxi Driver, actually, which is maybe even the same year, but it's not a sports film, number one. And it's not quite the same vibe, I think.
I think it's safe to say that it is a very different vibe, Nathan.
Yeah, exactly.
Could not be more different, arguably,
But I do actually think that maybe the sort of famous line from that movie of like, you looking at me, is maybe part of the sort of training montage sequence in that movie. But like before that, I can't find much about any kind of equivalent montage moment in a movie.
Right.
So I'm always hesitant to say this is the first because there's always something before this, but it brings together these elements in a very unique way where it's like, it's a montage. So it's not a scene. It's definitely using the film medium, right? It's got a bespoke song for the montage that's written for that scene. And the sort of arc of it is this idea of getting stronger, right?
Right. We're going to fly now.
He's going to fly now. Right.
We're going to fly now.
So that section is sort of sketched out very loosely in the script, but the idea of making it a montage is Avildsen.
Okay.
And so he started cutting it because again, he's an editor, right? Yep. So he starts cutting it. He gets a track from Conti, which we haven't even talked about. We have to talk about the music, but he gets a track from Conti, and then he's like, you know what? I'm really liking this footage. I need some more music. So he goes back to Conti and he gets another 30 seconds and then he keeps cutting. And then he's like, I have too much footage. I still need more. He goes back to Conti, asks for another 30 seconds. And so it stretches from like a couple minutes to like much, much longer.
Right.
And it becomes what we think of as this training montage. And I feel like you'd only get that from a director that also thinks like an editor and is able to create a tight loop between an editor and a composer, right? Yeah. In order to create this very unique thing. That feedback loop seems really important to developing the unique training montage of Rocky. So again, that moment that is so iconic to this movie, so iconic to film history, is, I think, coming out of mostly this relationship between John G. Avildsen and Conti, not Sylvester Stallone, you know?
It's also fascinating, too, because as we've said in other episodes, when you see these movies that have been parodied to death or referenced to death or like had major influences, sometimes the original thing can feel a little bit dated or not as effective as the subsequent versions. And I think what was so remarkable is that the training montage has been done to death. It's been parodied. You know, Team America, World Police has that great montage song. But somehow this didn't feel like it was dull. Like, it didn't feel derivative. Obviously, it's not derivative, but it doesn't have that feeling of like, oh, this has been done subsequently and done better. Like, it still feels fresh and not cliched, because I think the training montage becomes sort of a cliche that like, oh, like, how are we got to do a lot in very little time. Okay, like, cut to the montage.
I mean, even within the Rocky series, it becomes a cliche, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You know, it becomes a compulsory thing that has to be in the movie. I think one of the secrets of this one that makes it work so well is that there's almost a rehearsal of the training montage earlier in the movie, right?
Yes.
There's the scene where he wakes up. It's really early. He drinks 6 raw eggs.
Absolutely disgusting.
And then he goes out on a jog. And I think it is f***ing brilliant, where you have Conti's score. It's the sort of slower, sadder version of that score. This is one of the brilliant things about it, is that the theme really works either as a very like slow, sad piano sort of thing, or as this big booming, get those horns in there sort of score. And so he's got the sad version on. It feels like it's sort of slowly building momentum. You see him running through the streets of Philadelphia. He goes up the stairs of the Philadelphia Art Museum
and struggles.
He's out of breath. He's struggling. He's got a cramp. He barely makes it up, and then you watch him walk back down the stairs. And it's like, I think that is why the later montage works, because you've seen him do this before, and it was sad and hard, and now he's doing it again, and you get to see him really make it and be excited and all of that. I mean, it works, man.
No, it's one of those things that, again, it's the scene that was played in the AFI 100, is used in clip shows, is used in like other Oscar montages. A montage of a montage, arguably one of the most iconic moments in cinema history. And yet, when you see it in context, you're like, yeah, like this rules. Like, yeah, you're gonna fly. I'm gonna fly now. Like, it works. You understand how that becomes the thing that everybody else starts ripping off, because it's so well executed. And I think you're right. Seeing him go from barely able to make it up those steps to literally skipping multiple steps at once and then cheering himself on at the end. It's like, it's so incredibly effective.
Yeah, totally. And of course, this is the scene that is parodied in 2 of the other Simpsons episodes that we talked about at the very beginning. Brush with Greatness, Krusty gets canceled. You both get references to this training montage of Krusty punching a giant side of beef and Homer doing a sort of training montage in the sort of gray sweatsuit, of course, that Rocky famously wears in this scene. On a similar note, and this is sort of part of the montage, as well as other parts of the movie, is the use of Steadicam in this movie.
Right.
So this is one of the first movies to use Steadicam at all. The only one before this was Hal Ashby's Bound for Glory. That's it.
Interesting.
And so Steadicam was not even a patented technology at the time.
Wow.
And John G. Avildsen saw the demo reel for Steadicam from Garrett Brown, who is the inventor.
Yep.
And it actually includes a shot going up the Philadelphia Art Museum steps, because Garrett Brown was a Philadelphia guy. And so he was using it to demonstrate, like, look how smooth this is, even going up steps, right? Because of the gyroscope and all of that.
Right.
And so, like, Avildsen saw it and was not only interested in the technology, he's like, where are those steps? So, like, you know, again, like, he's bringing that to the table. Steadicam's really interesting in this movie. Like, one of the things that Garrett Brown points out in the commentary is that he uses it very sparingly at first, and Avildsen sort of introduces it more and more throughout the movie. Right. And it becomes part of the sort of momentum of the film, of like when he's jogging, right? Especially in that montage. And then in the final fight, there's a lot of Steadicam. They shot every round of the fight, both in the ring and outside of the ring using Steadicam as well as other stuff in order to get that kind of dynamism in the fight. So like he had the foresight to kind of take a gamble on this new technology, and it really becomes part of the vocabulary of how this movie looks. And of course, how every movie looks now.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Watching it in 2023, you can kind of take for granted that, oh yeah, like, of course there's Steadicam shots, but it's like, no, like that was not a thing prior to this. And it gives the film a very, very different look. It's interesting because I think most people, myself included, always associate The Shining with Steadicam. And I think there's that myth that like, oh, that was the first Steadicam movie. I didn't realize that it was in fact Rocky. So that's really interesting. And that Avildsen was the one that was pushing for it too. It makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, they were like the early adopters, and I feel like there was sort of subsequent films that popularized it too. Like, I mean, the Hal Ashby one is before this, but like didn't popularize it.
Yeah.
But Rocky, because it was this sort of breakout hit, I think sort of helps popularize it. And then, of course, The Shining further popularizes it, right? Moving along in the story, basically everything around that final fight is very driven by Avildsen in many ways. So, again, the night before, in the script, Rocky watches footage of Apollo Creed fighting and realizes he's not going to be able to beat him, basically. Of course, that's not what happens in the film.
No.
Avildsen is like, he should go to the ring. And I think, part of this is probably like, look, we don't need another set. We don't want to get the footage. Like, we don't have the budget.
Right.
We already have the ring set up. Like, just have him go to the set, basically. and the set can be empty because it's nighttime. So he goes there and he, is looking around the ring, and he looks at the big paintings, right? He sees Apollo Creed, and then he sees himself. And then the promoter comes in, and he's talking to the promoter, and he's like, hey, the poster's not right. I'm wearing whatever it is. Which colors? You remember the
red trunks with the white stripe, but I wear white trunks with the red stripe.
Right,
or whatever the line is, yeah.
So, fun fact, that was not in the script. What happened was the artists up.
Okay.
And they actually painted Rocky's poster wrong. And Avildsen was like, no problem, we'll just write it into the script.
Amazing.
And it works even better because it just shows no one cares about Rocky, and the promoter's line back to him is perfect. He's like, well, it doesn't really matter now, does it?
No, exactly.
It's
that's
perfect.
It's such a great moment.
Yeah, it puts a button on the exact theme that scene is supposed to be selling, which is not only is Rocky not going to win, but also no one cares anyways. You know, he's still a loser, even though he has put in all this training. He's not going to come out a winner. That scene is iconic to this movie and not at all how it's written in the script.
Oh.
And then, of course, the big fight. So the fascinating thing about this is, again, it's in the script in the sense that they fight in the script, but the details of what happens, not in there at all, basically.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because you said that the script was 98 pages, and what they tell you in film school or whatever is like each page is the equivalent of a minute. So that means that the film, in theory, would only be 98 minutes long, which it is not. It is just shy of 2 hours. So obviously there's moments throughout where they're adding stuff that's not necessarily on the page. And it makes sense that the fight would be one of those things. I remember I interviewed the writer of the first Mission Impossible movie. And that has one of my all-time favorite set pieces of any movie, the Langley heist, where, they basically, they have to steal the knock list. And I asked him, I was like, so what does that look like on the page? Because, like, I know for the script for Scream, when Kevin Williamson was writing it, there were certain sections where he would be like, okay, this is what needs to happen, but I'm just going to write, Wes will make it scary. Like, he would write out the sort of like, A to B to C, Wes will figure it out. And I was like, what was your approach? Like, is everything scripted there? Or was it one of those things of like, here's A to B to C and Brian De Palma will do the Brian De Palma thing and it will be very tense and very exciting. So I'm always fascinated by this idea of like, how do set pieces like this look on the page? Are they elaborately scripted out, like beat by beat by beat by beat? Or is it more like, and they fight? Right. So it sounds like that is maybe sort of what happened here.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think there was sort of the broad strokes of like probably what happens in each round, but not like the details. And basically, Avildsen was like, he went back and watched a bunch of earlier films, like The Harder They Fall, old boxing movies. And basically the conclusion he came to was like, these all look like crap. The fights look phony.
Right.
They just don't feel like a real boxing match. He also watched like actual boxing matches. And so what he wanted to do was he was like, we're going to do something that, to my knowledge, has not been done before, which is we're going to choreograph the whole fight front to back like a ballet. And then we're going to rehearse the hell out of it so that it can actually be done front to back and shot front to back. And so that's how they did it. And he basically said, Sylvester, I need you to go and basically write out every beat of this fight, literally every punch, like what is happening. He's choreographing the whole fight. So Stallone goes back and does that. They bring it into the rehearsal and they rehearse it for like 6 weeks. And of course, meanwhile, Avildsen's in there with his 8mm camera, capturing footage, figuring out all of the angles, and then also showing the footage back to the actors to be like, look, this isn't working. You need to do this better. You need to train harder before they actually do the final shoot. And they shot the fight at the very, very end of the production. So they're kind of doing this concurrently with the rest of the shoot. So already a pretty innovative approach to this. And I think it really shows in that scene. Again, it's so hard to detach this from like what we're so used to now. Because now this is like what everything looks like.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's like if you go back and watch those older movies, it's completely different, right? Like this changed the whole language of like what a boxing match looks like on film. Other than the fact that you're in the ring, it looks like a real fight. Like there are very few moments where you're like, oh, that's really phony. It looks like they're getting the crap beat out of them for the most part.
This is a question that I probably should have asked. We're an hour and 35 minutes into the recording. Probably should have asked an hour ago. Was Stallone a boxer? Like, did he have experience as a boxer and that's what like prompted him to do that? Or that was something he picked because he was like, oh, I can make a narrative around this. Like, how did the whole like boxing element come into play here? Because for you to say like that Avildsen went and said, like, I need you to write out beat by beat. Like, I imagine he would have to be pretty knowledgeable about boxing, but was he?
Yeah. To my knowledge, he is not a fighter.
Okay, interesting.
He did a lot of training. He did like 5 months of training with a boxer for this movie.
Right.
But like to my knowledge, no, he's not a boxer.
So it's not like one of those things of like Guy Ritchie movies did this a lot where they would like find like football stars and then like make them actors or whatever. But like that's not the case here. He just interesting.
He's always. Okay. I mean, I think he's always wanted to be an actor before this. And this just was inspired by that fight. He was just like, this is the right vehicle to tell the story of my plight as a person and just kind of transpose it onto boxing because maybe that's more exciting than watching someone fail at auditions or something.
Yeah, a little bit. It's a little more cinematic maybe, but
okay,
interesting. But that is really interesting that like, again, this movie hinges on this whole like element of it. And, after all this sort of down talking I did of Stallone, like, he is now maybe actual boxers would disagree, but to someone who knows jack shit about boxing, he and Carl Weathers are certainly very believable in their portrayal as professional boxers. Although I will say there were a couple shots, and maybe it's just because I'm watching like a 4K version of the film. There were a couple shots where I wasn't really clear whether or not like they were supposed to be landing shots or if they were missing. Like I was paying close attention to the commentators to try and be like, okay, was that him missing on purpose or like, so it was a little unclear at times, but ultimately, like when all is said and done, it was pretty clear again, because the commentators were like, oh, he's really going for the ribs or, oh, he's not letting go. And like, so.
Yeah. I think that usually the tell is that they talk about this on the commentary is that like one of the key things to selling this is the head snap. So whenever you see the head snap, they're supposed to be landing the punch basically.
Okay. Well, and it's interesting. We talked about it a lot in our King Kong episode, the idea of like sound and the importance of sound to all of this. I think that's the one element here that maybe it doesn't sound like how I feel like one of these fights would sound today. Like it's very muted in its sound effects. Like again, and again, I don't know enough about boxing to know what it actually sounds like, boxing gloves hitting flesh. But I feel like you kind of expect the sort of over the top sound effects, and like it doesn't do that, which is probably to its credit, but like there were just certain moments where it wasn't entirely clear was a blow landing or not, because I didn't have that more sort of like clear delineated sound effect or whatever.
Yeah.
The most famous example of this is obviously Raging Bull, and you know that, which is considered to be one of the best edited films ever. And how they deal with editing and sound of those fights is incredibly unique. But
yes, yeah. Fun fact about that: the inventor of the Steadicam was also brought onto that film to shoot the fights. But he was fired because his footage looked too much like Rocky.
No, well, there you go. Marty.
Yeah, it's like, you know, I mean, and when I think about those fights, I don't think that there's almost any, if any at all, Steadicam in it. I think it's usually much more still.
Yeah,
which is sort of part of the aesthetic of that
exactly.
film.
It's got a very
different take.
Hyper stylized. It's much less of this sort of. This feels like it's a professionally filmed boxing match.
Exactly.
Whereas that feels like a hyper stylized artistic interpretation of a boxing match.
Yeah, totally. That's one of the interesting things about the Creed movies is that they're the cinematography in those fights is pretty incredible, but actually the most recent one, Creed 3, I believe, they actually moved more in that stylized direction.
Yeah, I heard he was using like Dragon Ball as a reference point for his fights. Yeah, which is super interesting. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that was also shot in IMAX, and I saw it in IMAX.
Right.
I mean, it is pretty incredible to watch in that context. Really like nothing else, you know. This is why I love going to an IMAX movie. You know, the idea of shooting figures and close-ups and all of that in IMAX is always really interesting to me, rather than like big vistas, which is what I think people usually think of. So anyways, but it's fun watching that sort of style evolve over time from, you know, Avildsen being like, nothing's realistic, we need to make it look like a real fight, to, you know, Raging Bull being like, we're going to go all the way in the other direction and make it hyper stylized.
Yeah.
And now Creed kind of maybe playing with a little bit of both.
Yeah.
So the final thing that Avildsen really contributes is the ending to this movie, which again, written completely differently. Originally, I believe the crowd carries Rocky out on their shoulders, and it's like a big, you know, satisfying moment. And then at some point, they changed that idea to be like, wait a second, no one cares about Rocky. They should carry Apollo Creed out on their shoulders, and Rocky and Adrian will walk out to the parking lot together, and it'll be more about them. They shot that ending.
Oh.
And then eventually they were like, no, this isn't quite right either. Why are we kind of going all the way out and like having this big denouement? And so again, it was Avildsen who was sort of like, nope, we need to end it basically in the ring. And so they reshot the ending. And again, one of the most famous moments of this movie is Rocky calling Adrian, right?
Adrian.
And Avildsen gave Sylvester Stallone the direction for that line, saying, "You're like a wounded animal and you're looking for your mate," which is exactly what that sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was sort of inspired to do this because of Bill Conti's music as well, right? To think about this ending. So again, it's like Avildsen and Conti, man.
Yeah.
And again, that sort of editing mentality in the directing is so much part of this movie's DNA. And I just don't think it gets enough credit for that. So that's my big hot take. But have I convinced you?
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, I know very little about this movie going into it beyond it's Sylvester Stallone's Rocky. But by all accounts, yes, like he wrote it and he stars in it. But as is often the case with the sort of auteur theory, like films are not made by one person. It's kind of why I hate the auteur theory. I mean, yes, there are certain auteurs out there, certainly, but even those auteurs, like, they all rely on other people to make their art. You know, Wes Anderson's stuff doesn't work without his production designers and his costume people, and
totally,
you know, Quentin Tarantino's films don't work without his editor. Yes, granted, there are also those filmmakers who, like, they literally can do everything, like the Coen brothers or like a Steven Soderbergh, but still, like, it's still always a team effort. And the things I love most about this movie are not necessarily the things that Sylvester Stallone is bringing to the table, and it sounds like, anyway, are absolutely the things that Avildsen was bringing to the table.
Yeah, I feel like in the story, you know, often it's sort of like, I think literally in the commentary, Burt Young says something like, the script was pure gold, so anything on top of that was just platinum. Avildsen helped make it happen. He knew how to make a cheap movie, so we got him and he did it.
But anyone could have taken the script and it would have worked.
Right. And it's like, I actually don't totally buy that, because there were so many creative contributions to the script and to the story and the way it was acted on set that like it really evolved a lot from that script to the screen. If it was shot as the script was written, I don't know if it would have worked.
No,
I
think the movie would have been dog shit. Like, not to be rude, but like I said, the script is not really that strong. It's a simple story, and I always admire simple film. Not everything has to be complicated. But as you pointed out, the scene that turned me around was not Sylvester Stallone's scene. It was a scene that the director eventually crafted and molded and made work. So, yeah, no, I don't think this movie works without that, which, again, having not seen the sequels, I'd be curious how the sequels fare without John G. Avildsen at the helm, which is maybe a perfect way to segue into, what do you mean there's 6 Rocky movies? Because nothing about this movie screamed, we gotta make another. Although I recognize how Hollywood works. Cheap little movie
money screamed that.
Yeah, cheap little movie makes millions of dollars. We gotta make more of these pictures.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's like literally in the final scene, Rocky and Apollo are both,
no rematch. There will be no rematch.
There'll be no rematch. I don't want one. Yeah, that's literally like some of the last lines of the movie. And yet there were so many of these.
Rocky V plus Rocky II equals Rocky VII, Adrian's Revenge!
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. How do these fare? I think, all due respect, I really love these movies. I think they're a lot of fun. I do think they coast a lot on the tropes that are set out in this first movie. They play with them in interesting ways, but I think that, again, things like the training montage, not really in the script, not really Sylvester Stallone's invention, and yet every movie after that has a training montage. And upping the stakes on the training montage becomes part of the game of this series.
Right.
So it's there are things that are set out in this movie that really become just like the formula for the rest of these. They also evolve, I mean, again, like I made the joke at the beginning about this not being a fight film and that being the sort of party line when they were promoting this. The other movies are definitely fight films,
right?
Right? They are all about a big fight and the next big sort of challenge for Rocky, and sort of like a new training regime and a new opponent. Like that's the sort of.
So they're basically James Bond movies, but with boxing.
They kind of become that. Yeah, totally. There is a bit of that. They're very episodic. There's sort of some through lines, but you're going to get a certain arc throughout each movie.
Right, kind of formulaic. I think most people, when they use the term formulaic, they use it in a pejorative way, but like Bond movies are formulaic. Like they are, there's a formula. It's a cold open, gun barrel, theme song, get into the script, like, but that's what you go for. It's like, I want the formula. Like that's what I'm here for.
100%. And the variations on the formula become part of the fun. How are they going to surprise me a little here?
Yeah, turn it on its head.
Yeah, what's the balance of the different elements? When are they going to do this? When are they going to do that?
But if you forget certain parts of the formula, people get upset, which certainly is the case in the Bond series.
Yeah, absolutely. So, by comparison to the later sequels, this is the longest film in the original series.
Okay, I believe that.
Yep, it has the least...
Knowing that the other films are more fight movies, it makes sense that this would be the longest of the bunch.
Right, totally. And this is all taken from the, we talked about this in the Karate Kid episode, but the Rocky morphology thing, you can look up online. Lots of fun. This is sort of taken from that. This also has the least fighting, the least montage, the most training, and the most dialogue out of the whole series. It also has the longest uninterrupted dialogue sequence of all of them, which is basically the whole middle chunk of the movie.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's kind of interesting. It definitely evolves. But one thing I wanted to try, and maybe we can do this almost as a lightning round here, but I wanted to see if you could guess what the plot of each of the sequels is.
Well, okay. So here's the problem. I looked it up last night because I was like,
Oh,
I know there's 5. Well, but I don't really know the plot. All I know is that like I know who he fights in the first 4. I didn't go past 4. So I know the second movie is a rematch. No rematches, but a rematch with Apollo Creed for some reason. Yep. And then the third movie, they introduce a new character played by Mr. T. So he fights Mr. T. Okay. And then the fourth movie, he fights Dolph Lundgren from the USSR because it's the 80s.
Yep.
But again, I don't know the context for any of those. And then I have no idea what happens in 5 or 6. Based on the poster of 5, I would have thought that 5 would have been the like, oh, he's getting back in the ring. But I'm pretty sure that's what 6 is about. Because like 6, he was obviously like he was in his 60s when he made that. So I have to imagine that's maybe 5 is he's getting back in the ring, and 6 is he's going to train the next guy. Although that's what Creed is. So I have no idea what 5 and 6 would be about. That's not entirely. I know that he owns a restaurant in one of them for some reason. I did see that on Wikipedia, but again, I don't know the context for any of this
good
shit.
Level of detail.
Okay,
so we'll get your fresh reactions here on some of the details. So,
okay, perfect.
Okay, so Rocky 2.
Yeah.
Rocky 2. At the beginning of Rocky 2, Rocky retires.
Oh, of course he does. Retires from what? He's fought one fight.
From boxing. Well, like, the thing is, like, in the first movie, to your point, this is not a movie that calls out for a sequel.
No, it certainly does
Rocky
not.
Rocky is 30 years old in the first movie, which, younger than us, but, in boxing terms, I guess. He's been fighting for a while. He's, like, fighting in the backs of bars and stuff. Like, he talks about his legs being, like, a problem.
My legs don't work.
His back going out, and like he has like a dislocated finger. Like, he's pretty beat up in the first movie, and so it makes sense that in the second movie he's like, I'm done. This was enough for me. Like the whole idea of the first one is it's a 1 in a million shot. It's maybe his last shot at greatness, right?
Right.
So he retired.
I just think it's funny to say you're retired from a thing that you've done once. That's like, I don't know that it's technically retiring. It's like no one's asking you back, buddy. But sure. Okay, so he's retired. He's not boxing anymore.
Yeah, but then Apollo Creed goads him out of retirement, and Rocky finally beats him by learning to fight right-handed because he's a southpaw.
Because he's a Southie, right? Okay.
So that's the training montage in the second one.
Okay. Is Burgess Meredith in the second one?
He sure is. He's in most of these.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah,
because I have to assume in the sequel they're like, okay, we're gonna bring back Burgess Meredith, and we're more of that, like, because again, he's not in this very much, so.
Yeah, exactly. He becomes a key part of the whole formula.
Okay.
Pretty much the whole ensemble keeps coming back.
Oh, okay, interesting.
So Rocky 3. Yes. Rocky loses his title because now he's the heavyweight champion of the world because he beat
because he beats Apollo Creed. Okay.
So he loses his title to Mr. T, playing a character named Clubber Lang. All of the names in these movies are hilarious. They're very on the nose. And then he gets it back. That's the plot of the movie.
Cool. Great. I am assuming it's 72 minutes long.
It's pretty short. Along the way, Apollo and Rocky develop a bromance. And this is the movie where Eye of the Tiger comes from.
Oh, yes, of course. Of course. Yes, okay.
Yeah, and then Rocky, I believe, tries to retire again.
Yeah, oh, well, of course.
Okay, Rocky 4 starts with Paulie getting a robot.
Sorry, what?
Yeah, Rocky 4 is probably one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. It is so unbelievably outrageous. But like, so Rocky is basically like rich and famous, right?
Okay.
And so the Balboa family is like riding high in their big mansion, and Paulie gets a robot. It is the most 80s thing you could ever imagine.
What the hell is this?
Your present.
Yo, I wanted a sports car for my birthday. Not no walking trash can.
Other than that, what happens here? Oh, and I think maybe in Rocky 3, I think that is when Mickey dies.
Oh, okay. R.I.P.
He gets pushed over by Clubber Lang and has a heart attack.
Oh, poor Mickey.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this time it's personal.
Yeah. So no Mickey in Rocky 4.
Yeah, there you go. So Rocky 4, Paulie gets a robot. A Soviet Superman named Drago kills Apollo Creed in the ring.
Oh, Jesus.
This is at the very beginning of the movie. And Rocky is Apollo Creed's coach because they're all buddy-buddy now.
Right.
And Apollo's like, whatever you do, don't throw in the towel. And so Rocky like honors his wishes, but then Apollo Creed dies because of it.
Oh, Jesus.
So then Rocky drags some logs, runs through snow, and grows a beard until he's able to defeat Drago.
Yeah, this is very 80s. In fact, I will say this is the only other Rocky movie that I've sort of seen, because I don't know if you remember this, but at my bachelor party when we went to the jazz club after, like, we went for dinner and then we went to a jazz club, and of all things to be playing at said club, they had Rocky IV on the TVs.
That's hilarious.
So I remember seeing the training montage of him like carrying the logs or whatever, and I was like, what is this? And either you or Bill was like, it's Rocky IV. So there you go.
I'm pretty sure that one is also the one that's like something like 30% montage.
Right. Yeah.
It's sort of the peak of the excesses of the whole series, which is what makes it so much fun. All right, Rocky V. Avildsen returns to direct this one.
Okay.
Yes. And both he and Stallone have a really dark vision for what this movie's going to be, which would have ended with Rocky's death.
Yeah, you got to go gritty and dark.
Yep. And the studio was like, absolutely not. We are not killing our cash cow. But Avildsen stays on to direct, but he's very upset with the results, to the point where he actually released his own bootleg director's cut for this movie in the early 2000s.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this would have been
kind of
peak,
crazy.
like, that peak era where, you know, all of these franchises were like, okay, we're going to kill off the main character. This is the last one. Even though, like, we're definitely not going to, like, because you think about it, like, Freddy's dead and Jason goes to hell and Rocky V, Rocky's terminal illness or whatever. Like,
Right. Now that you mention it, it does kind of feel like a bit of a trend, except they do not allow that to happen. Basically, what ends up happening in this, Polly bankrupts the family.
Okay.
Rocky gets brain damage.
Robot. Robots are expensive.
Very expensive robots.
The upkeep on your robot.
That's right. It'll get you. I think he actually like gives power of attorney to their finance person, and then they just like screw them over. I don't know. Whatever. Rocky gets brain damage and retires again. The Balboas move back to the old neighborhood because they don't have any money.
Of course.
And then Rocky trains a young boxer named Tommy Gunn.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Instead of helping his son, who is being bullied at school. Turns out Tommy Gunn's an asshole, and Rocky ends up beating him up in a street fight, and that's the end of that movie.
Cool. Okay. So he doesn't die,
again,
he beats the shit out of his protege. Cool.
Yeah, pretty much. And I mean, again, think about what just happened in the last movie where he was like trying to win the Cold War fighting a Soviet Superman, and then now he's having like a street fight and like everything's falling apart in his life. I think people hate that one and see it as kind of the black sheep in the franchise. I kind of like it. I don't think it's a perfect movie, but again, it is that John G. Avildsen sort of touch. It feels a little bit more grounded, a bit more like the first one. There's a bit more darkness in it.
Right.
I think if Avildsen and Stallone had their way, I think it actually could have been a great ending to the franchise, but that's not what happened. And then the last one, because we're not going to talk about Creed, is Rocky Balboa. So in this one, Adrian dies off screen before the film starts. So Rocky's kind of alone. Paulie finally cleans up his act.
Oh, Paulie's still kicking around, though. Okay.
Yeah. And Rocky is lured out of retirement once again. He is a restaurateur in this one. Because there's a simulation on, some sports program of him fighting the current champ.
Right.
And in it, Rocky like wins by a slim margin. So the champ is like, I need to fight Rocky. The other really funny thing is that during the prize fight with Homer and Dredrick Tatum, they have guest star Michael Buffer, who is sort of a famous ring announcer, famous for his line, "Let's get ready to rumble." And this is sort of a funny instance of The Simpsons sort of not predicting the future, but kind of a back and forth between the things they're parodying and then real life, where they put Michael Buffer in this episode, and then Michael Buffer appeared in Rocky Balboa.
Oh,
he's actually an announcer in that movie. So it's funny how these things kind of come full circle that way.
So once again, The Simpsons did it first.
So Rocky gets kind of inspired to get like back in the ring and start boxing a little bit. And so he does fight and he goes the distance again and loses again, but comes out a mensch, basically.
Cool.
So that's the entire Rocky series in a nutshell.
I'm not gonna lie to you, you haven't sold me, but I can see how, if you're into, like, I like the James Bond movies, and they're all not necessarily very good, but like
of varying quality.
Yeah, of varying qualities. So okay, fair enough.
Yeah, Rocky Balboa. If you're gonna watch one, I think Rocky Balboa is pretty great. Rocky 2 is also pretty great.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to, but I appreciate the advice.
Fair enough. Anyone else out there who's Rocky curious, those are good places to start. All right, man. Well, were there any moments in this movie that felt like Simpsons jokes but weren't?
Yeah, a lot, actually. To the point where I'm not going to go through all of them, but I've highlighted a few of my favorites. I mean, I kind of have dumped on the writing a little bit, but there's a lot of really great quotable lines in this movie and some serious, like, laugh out loud funny jokes. So I'm just going to highlight a few of them. The first would be the doo-wop singing street gang. Feels very Simpson-y. Yeah. I don't understand what is happening. There's no context for it. There's no explanation for it. Oh, but Nate's saying there is.
Would it surprise you to know that one of those singers is Sylvester Stallone's brother?
It would not surprise me in the least. What's his name again?
It does make some sense. I don't remember.
Damn it. It's like Rick Stallone. No, it's not Rick. Frank Stallone. Yeah, he's put out some albums, I'm pretty sure.
Frank Stallone.
That makes sense. No, and then there's a great Simpsons-y line of, "You deaf? No, I'm short." I love that. I don't remember the context of who says it or why, but I thought it was really funny. Oh, this is not like a joke, but for whatever reason, it made me laugh really hard. At one point, he goes to meet, is it Grazzo? Whatever, the mob guy that he works for. Grazzo, who is played by an actor who is in The Godfather and a bunch of like Billy Friedkin movies. So he might come up again in other episodes of our show, but they go to a restaurant called Pat's King of Steaks. And it's just on a big sign that says Pat's King of Steaks. And I don't know why. That made me laugh.
It's a famous Philly institution. Philly cheesesteaks.
Yeah, no, I know. But it's the King of Steaks. It's funny.
King of Steaks.
And then I love how when Rocky comes in, he's got on the back of his robe, he's got like the name of the company Paulie works for. And like they're like, what are you doing that for? And it's like, Paulie gets $300 and like I get to keep the robe. But the commentators like mention it in a very Simpson-y way of being like,
the Italian stallion. Some meat sign on the back of his robe there. Have you seen what that was?
Like, it's just like one of those classic things of like, they would do that in The Simpsons where either someone was doing an impression of a famous sports commentator or they would actually get the real famous sports commentator to just comment on the absurdity of, because it's The Simpsons. Like I think of like when the pretzel episode, when they're throwing pretzels at Whitey Ford and
here come the pretzels. Hall of Famer Whitey Ford now on the field, pleading with the crowd for some kind of sanity.
Uh-oh, and a barrage of pretzels now knocking Whitey unconscious.
Anyway, it just felt very Simpsons-y. So,
or the Planet of the Horses commentary on the horse race.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of really great moments of levity and comedy in this movie that I was not expecting at all. Again, it's one of those things that made me enjoy the movie much more than I think I maybe anticipated. What about you? Was there anything that felt particularly Simpson-y to you?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that comes to mind immediately is when Rocky comes into the ring and he's got all of his like crew around him. They're all wearing pink shirts, which I believe was actually a laundry mishap, much like what happens on The Simpsons.
Okay, fair
enough.
Where
Homer's white shirt gets turned pink, and then he goes to the insane asylum and meets Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
So that immediately was like, oh. That's odd that they're all wearing pink for some reason. It's not the color I would have imagined for the folks in his corner, but sure. But yeah, no, you're right. There's a lot of good, funny moments in here, and also just like weird, quirky, unexpected stuff that kind of fits in the Simpsons universe. A lot of fun characters.
Totally. Well, how did this film, fare? I mean, knowing that it had 6 sequels and a spin-off series of 3 films, I'm going to imagine it didn't bomb. But, I mean, you never know. So, how did this movie do, Nate?
It did real well. The domestic gross was $117 million.
Oh, wow. Against a $1 million budget.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it did okay.
Big multiplier. Yeah. Again, that John G. Avildsen magic. It's like he had a track record of this, even with his like smaller movies where it was like tiny budgets, huge multipliers. Damn. But to put it in context, the whole franchise has made $1.9 billion. And when you add up all of the budgets add up to $279 million.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so it's a hell of a lot of money. People love these movies. They keep coming to these movies. And I feel like Creed is going to keep them going for a while. And then on top of that, this movie, not so much the sequels, but this movie was a real critical hit as well. Again, they did a really good job of courting the critics.
Right.
They were doing the late night circuits. They had their story down. Even early days, they were getting critics on set. They were getting critics, weighing in on the script, seeing footage, all this kind of stuff, sort of warming them up to have a positive reaction to the movie. It kept getting described again and again as a sleeper hit by various critics. I think the Academy Awards, same deal. They were really just like pushing it really, really hard. It ends up winning Best Picture, of course. John G. Avildsen gets his Best Director. And it also gets Best Film Editing, all at the Academy Awards. It's nominated for a bunch more, too. You have Sylvester Stallone for Best Actor, Talia Shire for Best Actress, Burt Young and Burgess Meredith for Supporting. So again, one of those rare double nominations. Best Original Screenplay, Best Original Song, and Best Sound. Shocking this didn't win Best Original Song.
Yeah, what did?
Evergreen by Barbra Streisand.
Oh, okay. Babs. Old Babs.
Yeah, it's from A Star is Born.
Oh, okay. Well, that would make sense. So this movie beat All the President's Men at the Oscars. Wow.
Yeah.
Damn.
To your earlier point, it really tapped into a hunger that people had at that moment in time.
Yeah, absolutely.
For something that you could believe in that also didn't feel out of step with the moment. Right. And I think this movie really threaded that needle perfectly of feeling grounded, recognizing the challenges, recognizing how hard things are, and then also convincing you that, the American dream is alive and well. Roger Ebert was one of the people who was really sold on this at the time. He gave it 4 out of 4 stars in his review. And he says, what makes the movie extraordinary is that it doesn't try to surprise us with an original plot, with twists and complications. It wants to involve us on an elemental, a sometimes savage level. It's about heroism and realizing your potential, about taking your best shot and sticking by your girl. It sounds not only cliched, but corny, and yet it's not a bit, because it really does work on those levels. It involves us emotionally, makes us commit ourselves. We find, maybe to our surprise, after remaining detached during so many movies, that this time we care. Which I think is about right in a lot of ways. You really don't want to buy into this movie necessarily, but I think it wins most people over.
Yeah.
Except for Vincent Canby at the New York Times, who called it 30s make-believe. Clearly, he was sort of not so happy about the throwback to Frank Capra. At the end of his review, he says, the problem, I think, comes back to Mr. Stallone. Throughout the movie, we are asked to believe that his Rocky is compassionate, interesting, even heroic, though the character we see is simply an unconvincing actor imitating a lug. Pretty rough.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess that's one way to put it.
Like we were saying, I think in one of our recent episodes, it's like, look, if you get turned off by something early on, you're not going to buy into anything else, right?
Yeah.
You're going to notice every little flaw in the film if you're turned off early on. And so, look, if you don't buy into Sylvester Stallone in this movie, you're not going to care about the rest of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally reliant on buying into his performance, at least at a sort of basic level.
Yeah.
But what about for you, Adam? What do you think? Do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses? Is it something you'd recommend?
Look, I definitely think the strengths outweigh the weaknesses, no question. I mean, I went into this not anticipating that I was going to enjoy it very much and was surprised at how much I did. would I recommend it? I think I would. I think even for people like me who don't enjoy sports movies, who normally this would not be their cup of tea, I think it will win most people over. If you get to the end of the first date sequence and that hasn't hooked you, then I would say turn it off. For me, that was the turning point. If you're not buying into it by that point, I don't think there's anything that's going to win you over. So by that point, you can just call it a loss. It's probably like 45 minutes into the movie or whatever. So like, it's not one of those things of like, oh, you're getting an hour and 20 in. But yeah, for all the film's flaws, and I do think it is a flawed film.
Sure.
I do think that the strengths absolutely outweigh the weaknesses, and it's worth seeing, if only for Avildsen's contributions alone. There's definitely something here.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's safe to say that I agree. I mean, I do think that this is, for me, kind of borderline masterpiece status.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I think that there are, like you said, there's very little that I would cut about this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And almost every scene has a sort of alchemy to it where the script, the acting, the filmmaking are all coming together in this way that like make every scene memorable, unique, interesting, something you haven't seen on film before. It is one of those movies that sort of convinced me that digging into these movies that are highly parodied in the pop culture is worthwhile, because yes, there are those moments that you already know in this movie, right? But there is so much below the surface worth digging into that will surprise you. It's not what you expect. It's not a fight movie, right? There are a lot of interesting character moments, funny moments. There's a love story. Like, there's so much that is below just, yelling Adrian and a training montage. So I would say definitely check it out. What about a double feature? What would you recommend as extra credit to tag on to this movie as a nice comparison?
Well, see, this is what's interesting, because the entire time I was watching it, I couldn't help but think about The Karate Kid, which we obviously talked about in our first season. And I went into knowing absolutely nothing about, kind of thinking it was a joke, and coming away from it loving that film. I know that it's maybe unfair because it's not really a competition, but I think Karate Kid's a vastly superior film. And
wow.
Yeah, and I enjoyed it much more than this. Like, as much as I did, like, I enjoyed this movie, but it's not like something I like feel the need to watch the sequels of or rush back to revisit. Whereas, like I said, after watching The Karate Kid, I was like, I can't wait to like show this to my son one day. Like, I really, really enjoyed that experience. It's interesting knowing that they come from the same filmmaker and that Karate Kid comes second, because it really does feel not someone who's just playing the hits again, but taking the lessons learned from this and applying them and refining them to create a similar but superior picture. And maybe it's the fact that it's a kid and you can't help but root for him, and like the Miyagi character is there, who would be, I guess the equivalent would be like the Burgess Meredith character, but like Miyagi's there from almost the beginning, and it really is a mentorship and lessons learned and all this stuff. I think that film is so brilliant and does a lot of the same things that this film does, but I think, like I said, it takes the lessons of this film, refines it, makes it even better. And I imagine that watching those two in a double feature would be a really interesting and entertaining viewing experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
What about you? What would you pair with this?
So I was thinking about this. We were talking about this off mic a little while ago, but I think that Saturday Night Fever would be my pick.
Interesting.
For a couple reasons. I think it's a really interesting comparison point because it is also a sort of sports movie in a sense. I don't know if people think of it that way, but it's like it's about dance competition. It's got a similar sort of milieu where like the main characters are, in Brooklyn. They're actually in the neighborhood that I used to live in New York, called Bay Ridge, which at the time was like a very working class neighborhood, sort of similar vibes to Rocky. And I think the interesting thing is that Avildsen was actually supposed to direct it.
Oh.
And he turned down Rocky II because he was working on Saturday Night Fever. However, he was let go from the film because he wanted to have a happy ending.
Oh, interesting.
I'm not sure if it was the producer or the writer was like, absolutely not. This movie does not have a happy ending. He was fired literally when he was finding out that Rocky was nominated for 10 Oscars.
Wow.
He was like having the conversation with the producer, and a PA came in and it was like, hey, by the way.
I know you're being fired right now, but your movie just got nominated for 10 Oscars, so.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that Avildsen was attracted to that project, and you can definitely see some of the through lines in the movie, but it does have a much more new Hollywood kind of ending that's a little bit ambiguous, pretty dark. There's a bit of a sense of like a light at the end of the tunnel in that movie, but it's not quite as a resounding victory as Rocky. But it's also great, and fantastic performances, very grounded performances. You have John Travolta sort of at the height of his power, star-making sort of performance. But it's not what you expect. You have sort of an idea of what this movie is, and the sort of, classic images of Travolta in his white suit doing disco dancing. But there's a whole story there behind those scenes and around those scenes. A pretty good ensemble cast that's really grounding it in a reality that might surprise you. So I definitely recommend checking that movie out.
Cool. So that brings us to the end of this episode. And as always, we like to tease our next episode, but we want to keep it a little bit of a surprise for you. But we will say this, we will be celebrating a cinematic classic that is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, which is hard to believe, but also very, very exciting. So be sure to tune in next time to find out what we will be chatting about. Until then, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by thatshelf.com. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review and share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. We really appreciate it. It goes a long way. Even just retweeting our posts or re-Xing our posts. What do we say now? Good Lord. I just...
Reskeeting? Reseating?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, we're on TikTok too, so you can re-tick us. TikTok. Anyway, all that is to say, we appreciate any and all support. So thanks again for listening, and until next time, Nate,
we'll see you around the Plex.
See you around the Plex. I just realized the thing we didn't talk about in this episode. This is another one of those cases of a movie turned into a musical unnecessarily. The Rocky musical, which my parents have seen because they did it in Cambridge, and like apparently they were like, "Oh, it's really cool!" Like they turned so they basically had like the ring comes down onto the stage, but then they used the sides of the ring were up, and then they wore like roller skates for the skating scene, and they were like, "Oh, it was actually really convincing." And like, anyway, it doesn't seem
sort
like
of always wanted to see a skating date on stage faithfully reproduced.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know. I'm gonna look it up. I don't know if it's like original music or a jukebox musical or original music by Stephen Flaherty.
Well, if it's not by Bill Conti, I don't want to hear it.
Yeah. I mean, it's got to have Gonna Fly now, right? Like, they're going to have to.
I would hope so, but you never know with these things.
Oh my God. Okay. This is great bonus content. First song of the show is called Ain't Down Yet. That's sung by The Company. The second song of the show is called My Nose Ain't Broken, sung by Rocky.
Right.
A few songs later, we get My Nose Ain't Broken reprise.
Well, that's an important arc in the movie that, Burgess Meredith is like, your nose ain't broken. You should retire while you're still pretty. And then, of course, he breaks his nose in the final fight because now he's a real boxer.
Yeah. Well, according to the cast recording that was put out, Gonna Fly Now is on the album, but it's only 38 seconds long. And then there's a training montage. Training montage number 2 features Eye of the Tiger. So... Oh, and then the fight, round 15, Gonna Fly Now. So clearly they've incorporated the hits. But I guess I'm going to have to get you a copy of this.
The album?
Yeah.
Okay. I will graciously accept that.
It won Best Scenic Design at the Tonys. So
okay,
there you go.
Wow. Gonna Fly
gonna fly now. Directed by Alex Timbers, he's the guy who directs all of the movie musicals. Like he did Beetlejuice and Moulin Rouge, and he's doing another one, I think. But anyway, it's just I think that's hilarious that Rocky the musical exists, because it does not need to exist. But
yeah, no, not really.